Hello, I'm Darren Jordan. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your look at the world of business and economics. This week, accusations of being an $800 billion super spreader of hate, disinformation and lies. Is it time to break up Facebook for killing off the competition? The rise and fall of the middle class. The pandemic destroys 2 decades of poverty reduction, but this time it's urbanites who've been hit the hardest. We find out why. And the last oil and gas frontier, Namibia is selling off licenses to the world's biggest oil companies. But environmentalists are concerned that fracking for shale could destroy elephant habitats and water supplies. Now, $70 billion in revenue, 1.8 billion active users, and worth more than $800 billion. Facebook must be doing something right in catering for the world's desire to connect. But there's a darker side to Mark Zuckerberg's social media company. Some say the platform has pushed Holocaust denial, genocide, and it's a super spreader of falsehoods. And it's accused of being a home to anti-vaxxers, political conspiracies, and disinformation. So just how did it get so big? Well, it crushed the competition through acquisitions, copycat products, and throttling news content providers. Well, the only time it's been held to account was for the misuse of data by Cambridge Analytica, which also worked on President Trump's 2016 presidential campaign. During that time, the network was used to spread misinformation. Facebook was fined $5 billion, a slap on the wrist for such a huge company. But it may be hit with another antitrust lawsuit, possibly in November. That's according to the Washington Post. And a Biden victory could see the social media company being broken up. Facebook, along with the likes of Google and Amazon, have been forewarned by the Democrats that they're abusing their market positions. Facebook has been accused of being a monopoly and pretty much competing against itself after the 2012 acquisition of Instagram. And the company has been accused of tinkering with its algorithms to give more prominence to right-wing sites. Zuckerberg has even courted right-wing commentators and regularly talks to Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. Facebook was used to promote genocide in Myanmar, and its India operations have been accused of allowing right-wing politicians to spread hate, all to curry favour with Prime Minister Narendra Modi's ruling party. And let's not forget the site was used to broadcast live the murder of scores of Muslim worshippers in 2 New Zealand mosques. So far, only Google has been hit by a US lawsuit for anti-competitive behaviour. The case focuses on payment it gives to phone makers to make sure its search engine is the preferred choice. The European Union has successfully sued Google for abusing its power on Android phones, favouring its own products in search results and stopping websites from using rival ad sellers. All in all, Google has paid more than $9 billion in fines to the EU. So there's lots to discuss here. Joining me now from St. Gallen in Switzerland is Miriam Baiten. Miriam is Assistant Professor of Law and Economics at the St. Gallen University. Miriam, great to have you on the programme. So how likely is it then, the breakup of Facebook and other big tech companies?
Well, the digital chief of the European Commission said yesterday to be cautious with this instrument because we would have very lengthy legal proceedings. But one question also is, what would breaking up big tech achieve for consumers? An important thing to understand about these platforms is that they're networks, and so they become more valuable as more users join them. And that means that already big platforms tend to become bigger. And we have to ask ourselves, if we were to break up a company like Facebook, if the result would simply be that the process repeats itself and we end up with one big social network once again.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Miriam, that the EU has been more successful than the US in taking on companies like Google, Facebook, Microsoft. What do you think is behind the EU's success doing that?
Well, the EU seems to have been more active in the past couple of years in this area, with investigations into Google and Apple and Facebook in Germany as well. I do think that the US is catching up now. I think there's just more willingness now in the US politically and maybe just among people to do something and to rein in the power of big tech.
So how would you then go about limiting the power of Facebook? Would you split off Instagram, split off WhatsApp?
Well, as I said, splitting these off or breaking them up, we have to see if that's going to be the solution. With Facebook and WhatsApp, one of the main concerns for consumers in the end is the data that are being collected about them. And so antitrust has some instruments that we can use to do something about that. Big dominant platforms are not allowed to abuse their dominant position, but I think we'll need instruments outside antitrust as well. We'll need privacy laws, data protection laws to stop companies from collecting too much data about us and from using the data in ways that we don't agree with.
And that's an interesting point you make, Miriam, because in the old days, competition rules came down to price. But now, as you say, it's all about personal data. So where do we start with putting a value on data as a commodity and limiting companies like Google and Facebook to our personal data?
That's a very difficult question indeed. A lot of people have been writing and thinking about this. How do we value this data? For antitrust authorities, it's difficult to say, well, this is too much data collection. And for consumers, it's difficult to know, is this too much? We'll see a price that gets higher, but we don't always know what data are collected about us. And so, again, I think that's a problem that not only antitrust authorities can solve, but we'll have to look at other ways. We'll have to strengthen data protection authorities, make sure that they're funded well, that they have the resources to enforce rules on data protection. Like in the EU, we have the General Data Protection Regulation that makes sure that companies are limited in what they can do with our data. I personally think that's a more fruitful way forward than trying to value the data per se. But in antitrust law, we'll need to have a look at the value of data in other areas, such as merger control. We might want to look at acquisitions when companies have a lot of data, even if they might not be making a lot of profit yet.
So how do we then, Miriam, go about improving competition? I mean, some of the big tech companies seem to just copy what's out there. I mean, even Facebook has attempted to make its own version of TikTok.
Well, I think there are several instruments. One in competition law is that we might want to strengthen merger control. And so that means tougher standards. Maybe we want merging parties to prove to us that an acquisition is beneficial. Other than breaking up big tech, we might want to have a look at all the companies that big tech companies have been acquiring in the last couple of years. But we might need to look outside of competition law as well and look at regulation. As I said, data protection regulation, but maybe other types of regulation as well for the behavior of these tech companies.
So let me just get a final thought from you, Miriam. I mean, if any country is going to implement the breakup of these big tech companies, it has to be the United States. I mean, we all remember when they forced Microsoft to unbundle Internet Explorer from its Windows package. And ironically, that opened up the way for Google's browser.
Absolutely. Well, so that's something that I think the US is looking into now in their investigation into Google. It's a bit similar to what the European Commission did in 2018, essentially looking at tying and bundling, saying, well, you're a dominant company, and so you cannot use your market power in one market to try and gain market power in another market. We'll see if they can stop Google from, for example, making Google Chrome the standard browser on lots of phones. I think that would be one way to start for sure.
Miriam Byten, great to get your thoughts. Thank you for talking to Counting the Cost. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, the last 2 decades have seen a remarkable reduction in global poverty, but that is all about to be undone by the coronavirus pandemic. Those falling back into poverty are not the people you'd most likely associate with being poor. The World Bank says the new poor are relatively well-educated, living in cities and towns and in middle-income countries. So where are those middle-income countries? Well, they're in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. The pandemic will push up to 115 million people into extreme poverty this year, which the bank defines as living on less than $1.90 a day. So what can be done to help the new poor and reverse the rise in poverty? Well, to answer that and more, let's talk to Carolina Sanchez-Paramo. She joins us via Skype from Washington, D.C., where she's the World Bank's Director of the Poverty and Equity Global Practice. Carolina, great to have you on the program. So what exactly is pushing the middle classes back into poverty, do you think?
what the emerging evidence about the impacts of COVID-19 and the associated economic crisis on households tells us is that these impacts are significant, they are felt broadly, and they are materializing very fast. Our projections suggest that COVID-19 will push between 88 and 115 million people into extreme poverty this year, and that number could go up to 150 million in 2021. And these new poor mostly will reside in middle-income countries and look a little bit different from the existing poor, meaning those that were poor before the COVID crisis, in the sense that they are relatively more urban, they are relatively more educated, they tend to work in the informal service and construction sector. They are not, however, coming from the middle class, and instead we see these groups, the groups that are being most affected, what we call the economically insecure and sometimes the aspiring middle classes in some of these middle-income countries. So what's in a way driving this, as you were asking? It's really a combination of two things. Very significant declines in labor incomes due to job losses and wage cuts across the board in many countries. And second, a reduction in non-labor income, particularly remittances from domestic and international migrants.
Carolina, let me jump in there and ask you, was lockdown the right thing to do then for these low and middle income countries?
I think when we think about this, we need to remember that decisions were being made at a time where very little was known about the virus, and governments had to take policy actions and make policy choices under considerable uncertainty. And even though we do know more now about the short-term impacts of COVID-19 and the crisis, there's still a lot that we don't know about the potential long-term impacts or the nature and shape of the recovery. So in that context, our focus has been in supporting governments' efforts as they try to, on the one hand, protect lives, and on the other hand, to support livelihoods, protect those livelihoods.
So let me jump in here, Carolina. I mean, do you think then there was an alternative to the lockdown? I mean, was there any way to have kept these economies going?
Frankly, I think, as I said, it is very hard to tell. I think in hindsight, we can all have hypothesize about, things that could have been done differently. But I think we need to focus on the fact that in many places, even in the context of lockdown, significant efforts were made to, as I said, protect lives on the one hand through, a health response, and at the same time, protect livelihoods, which was one of the main concerns that we had, particularly for the poor and the vulnerable.
And it is worth pointing out, Carolina, I mean, this ends a 20-year decline in poverty reduction. But what was behind that reduction, do you think?
You're right that, the last few decades have been witness to unprecedented progress in extreme poverty reduction, with the global extreme poverty rate falling from 35% in 1990 to under 10% earlier this year. And even though the experience of countries, is different, I think there are three factors that we can really point to in understanding this very positive trend that we saw. First, economic growth, fueled to a large extent by an increase in international trade, was critical to generate new economic opportunities. Second, investments in human capital, health and education, and a rapid increase in financial inclusion of the poor and the vulnerable basically meant that these groups were able to take advantage of those new economic opportunities. And then finally, this is a period when we've seen a very rapid expansion, particularly in middle and low-income countries, of safety net programs that protect those that were lifted out of poverty from falling back into poverty again. So it's really a combination of those three factors.
So, Carolina, let me ask you to gaze into your crystal ball then. I mean, assuming we are able to get a vaccine, how long do you think it'll take to reverse this decline?
Darren, as I said, we're in the midst of the worst reversal in poverty reduction that we've had since we started to monitor it systematically, in 1990. So I think it's quite clear that reversing this will not be easy and will not be quick. Our projections show that global poverty rates will be about 7% by the year 2030, based on historical growth rates and assuming no increases in inequality. And they could be up to 8.6% if inequality were to increase by 1 percentage point per year over the next decade, which, given what we know about previous pandemics, is actually quite likely to happen. So in this context, what's very clear is that we need swift, significant, and sustained action by governments and development partners to promote and support a strong recovery and reverse this reversal ultimately.
Absolutely. So just talk us through quickly, Carolina, what governments need to do, because if they do spend more, where does that money come from?
So in these first few months, as I said earlier, the focus has been very much on fighting the pandemic and protecting households and firms. And given the magnitude of the shock, that has, required significant resources. So we see governments across the world using a variety of strategies to deal with this, including reprioritization of existing spending, and when possible, mobilizing additional fiscal resources. But in many cases, these efforts have not been enough, given the needs of the moment. And that's why the World Bank and the IMF, together with the G20 countries, have supported the suspension of debt service payments for low-income countries in order to create additional fiscal space.
Carolina Sanchez-Paramo, we have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for talking to Counting the Cost. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, Brazil is the world's third largest food producer, but new data has revealed that more than 10 million Brazilians are going hungry. And as the coronavirus pandemic plunges more people into poverty, that number is set to get worse. Monica Yanakiev reports.
There's no shortage of healthy food in this bustling street market in Rio de Janeiro. The COVID-19 pandemic may have crippled Brazil's economy, but it still produces enough to feed 1/6 of the Earth's population, something President Jair Bolsonaro made a point of reminding world leaders at this year's UN General Assembly.
No Brasil, despite the international crisis, Brazil's agricultural production never stops, and we produced enough to feed 1 billion people.
Yet more than 10 million Brazilians experience severe food insecurity, according to government data just released by the Brazilian Institute of Geography and Statistics. And that was before the coronavirus pandemic. Now the situation is worse.
Sempre existiu, mas era invisível.
Poverty has always been a problem in Brazil, but the poor were invisible. The pandemic is showing hunger's true face.
Ana Cláudia used to organize tourism events in Austria. She returned to Brazil for a short visit, but ended up staying to work as a volunteer in a soup kitchen. Most of these people in this line lost their jobs to the recession and the pandemic, like Paulo Miranda, who left his small town to look for work in Rio de Janeiro.
The coronavirus left me stranded here and homeless, but at least I'm getting fed and can use the public bathroom to bathe 3 times a week.
According to a UNICEF survey, during the first months of the pandemic, the number of hungry in Brazil rose dramatically.
One in every 5 Brazilians went hungry or admitted not having enough money to buy food. The population as a whole lost about half of its income, but families with children and adolescents suffered a bigger loss of 63%.
Brazil is still the world's third largest producer of food. Much of it is sold abroad.
Last year, Brazilians exported $32 billion worth of agricultural products to 180 countries. But experts are warning the government that the country may soon be back on the United Nations hunger map.
It's a place Brazil had left 6 years ago.
Now, Namibia is often described as the last oil frontier. It's a country that's known for its uranium and diamonds. But in the last few years, the oil industry has been beating a path to its door. But no commercial deposits have been found yet. But that hasn't stopped oil companies from snapping up licenses to drill. ReconAfrica, a small Canadian oil company, plans to begin drilling in the north of the country. There's thought to be around 11 billion barrels of oil in that area. But most, if not all, is shale. And that has environmental activists up in arms because they believe it'll endanger local wildlife and communities. ReconAfrica is drilling in Namibia's Kavango Basin, where the country has the largest elephant population. It also supplies water into neighbouring Botswana's Okavango Delta. So let's talk to Scott Evans. He's the Chief Executive Officer of ReconAfrica and joins us via Skype from Dallas. Scott, welcome to the programme. Let me ask you first, with all the meticulous work that goes into the search for oil, how much oil and gas is there offshore, and onshore in Namibia?
Well, first, thanks, Darren, for having me on the show. We're really focused on the onshore, so I can answer the question for the area we're working, which is the Kavango Basin. So this is a brand new sedimentary basin recently discovered, 8.75 million acres northeast Namibia and northwest Botswana in the Kalahari Desert. We see over, according to third-party experts, 100 billion barrels that's been generated. Now that won't all be recovered, but we see it to be potentially of the large to giant petroleum oil field sizes. So a significant resource.
And Scott, how does that then compare to neighboring countries and the rest of Africa?
Well, I think that it would, again, we're in the exploration phase, so there's uncertainty here. But I think it would be comparable to some of the fields of scale, say, in Angola next door. So we, again, we're looking at a field size distribution at this point, but we, again, think it's significant.
And of course, if you do manage to get to the oil, this could be a huge boost to the Namibian economy, which is currently worth around $15 billion. And with a population, I think, of around 2 million people, this could change lives, couldn't it?
Well, yeah, it really could. Namibia uses approximately, let's say, 26,000 barrels a day right now. Success for us would allow Namibia to become an exporter of oil and achieve, probably more importantly, power independence. Oil and gas can not only generate income for this industry in itself, it spawns a lot of other industries with the generation of power.
And just tell us briefly, Scott, a little bit more about this patch in Namibia where you plan to do your drilling for oil.
Sure. So again, northeast corner of Namibia, northwest Botswana, we're all within the Kalahari Desert. So it's an area that's been lightly populated, I think some agriculture, but an area that is well served by infrastructure. One of the things that attracted us to Namibia is the general overall good infrastructure, very stable government. The fiscal terms are quite good, so it's a great place to do business. But where we are is again in the Kalahari Desert, so we have to be mindful of taking care of that.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point you make, Scott, because it's also an environmentally sensitive site. It's a huge elephant reserve. It has a conservation area, World Heritage sites, and of course, a source of water for neighboring Botswana.
Yeah, so we are absolutely focused on environmental and social governance in our operations. We are following all the Namibian regulations and policies, plus international best practices. The things you refer to, we refer to as no activity zones, areas where we won't work, we'll have buffers around them. And this is going to include the parks, reserves, rivers, deltas, and community sites. We have local expertise. These have to be locally involved practices, but we're going to make sure that we do everything in a proactive manner.
And of course, the oil price at the moment stands at around $40 a barrel. That's pretty low. Is that going to hinder your ability to explore for oil, Scott?
Well, we are quite well funded. We have an exciting story, and you don't see a new basin. I'm a geologist every day. So at $40, given it's onshore, given we're looking at conventional reservoirs, we do think that we have good economics. Could be better, of course. But we're proceeding with our program as our first well at the end of the year.
So let's just go back to the environment for a second. I mean, can you 100% guarantee that when you frack for this oil, that you're not going to damage the local area, including contaminating local water supplies?
Well, so 2 points on that. First, we aren't going to be fracking. We never have planned to frack. We're looking for conventional reservoirs that don't require that technique. So you won't find that in our plans or in our equipment or anything like that. So fracking is not part of it. We want conventional reservoirs that flow naturally on their own. Second part, we are very focused on water resource management. So what's that mean? That has three basic tenets: protection of the aquifer and management of it, as you mentioned, but also surface water management and drainage. And then, as I alluded to earlier, buffer zones. So we have to steward the environment. We have to make sure that the local industries keep going, tourism, agriculture. But we have plans in place and have great cooperation with our local partners to do so.
Scott Evans, we have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for talking to Counting the Cost. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Darren. Have a good evening.
And that is our show for this week. But remember, you can get in touch with us via Twitter. Use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or you can drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. And there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has links and entire episodes for you to catch up on. Well, that's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Darren Jordan. From the whole team here, thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.